Cast your mind back to 2011 and Google teasing and then unveiling something extraordinary, the Galaxy Nexus here, made by Samsung with an enormous, at the time, 4.7-inch display. It seemed outrageous at the time, totally out of place, yet Google had seen the future and was aiming squarely at it. With hindsight, of course, the parallel track of the stylus-equipped Galaxy Notes and size increases across the board make the Galaxy Nexus look rather small and quaint now. Yet the launch of this, the Motorola-made Nexus 6, reminds me a lot of those halcyon days, with the lingering question, has Google seen the future yet again? The form factor, dramatically larger than even Samsung's unashamedly stylus-based two-handed phablet, the Galaxy Notes, is the thing to focus on here, which is odd considering that the specifications should be the star of the show. Even more so than with the Nexus 5, Google has commissioned a device with cutting-edge internals. A 5.96-inch AMOLED display, QHD, that's uppercase Q resolution, a Qualcomm Snapdragon 805 chipset with 2.7 GHz processor, 3 GB RAM, up to 64 GB of internal storage. These are just about the highest specs on the planet right now. Add in a decent 13 megapixel camera with OIS and 4K video capture, and you've got a terrific high-end device in theory. However, designing a great smartphone also means marrying specifications and components into a whole that works well all day. And here's where the admittedly first world issues kind of start. Battery life isn't as stellar as it should be. The integral 3220 mAh cell gives the Nexus 6 a full day of life, but no more. One of the side products of these bigger form factors is supposed to be bigger batteries and longer battery life. But this hasn't happened here. The use of this huge AMOLED screen, allied with Google's love of white themes for their Android applications, means that the vast majority of battery resources go to just keeping the display lit. And although not the Nexus 6's fault per se, bigger screens naturally mean the user is tempted to do more on them. The 6 almost needs a tablet-class battery, and it hasn't. Day-to-day performance isn't quite as stellar as you'd expect either. Again, the higher resolution screen is partly to blame, with more pixels for the chipset to throw around, though there are other factors too. In no particular order, there's the built-in whole disk encryption that's in place from the factory, designed so that even hardware cracking tech can't uncover your secrets on a password-locked Nexus 6. Good to have, I guess, and I can't prove it's slowing down the device, but there's surely an effect. Then there's the early state of Android 5.x lollipop. At 5.0.1 on the review device, it's clear that there are many fixes and optimizations still needed. 5.0.2 is imminent and 5.1 already being talked about next month. I'm confident the 6 will improve in both speed and endurance in time. Most of all, though, in terms of user interface speed, it's limited by the insistence in Android 5.x Lollipop of transitions and material inertia, letting the user see and feel what's going on, i.e. which windows and which pane went where. Hardcore geeks like me would much rather have the option to disable all these transitions and enjoy a much faster experience. But the theory goes that the man in the street will understand the interface more if it's obvious which icon became which window and so on. With iOS and Windows Phone already firmly in the transitions are best camp, it does seem as if this is the way of the future. Let's not be too churlish though. Despite the highish price, starting at around £500 for the 32 gig model in the UK, the Nexus 6 is still an awful lot of mobile computer for your money. The screen is terrific in clarity and colour. Admittedly, I'm a fan of AMOLED technology with its saturated colours and true black, so I'm biased, but the Nexus 6's panel is almost up there with the Note 4's. The front-mounted top and bottom stereo speakers are very loud. Cover your ears, here's a demo. Fidelity isn't quite up to the bass and high end of the HTC One M8 benchmark, but volume is terrific. The reason they're slightly proud of the Nexus 6 screen at either end, by the way, is, I'm guessing, to help prevent scratches and damage the glass if you place the Nexus 6 face down on a dirty surface. Yes, there's Gorilla Glass here, but better safe than sorry. In terms of build materials, it's a really solid aluminium chassis with iPhone-style aerial brakes around its outer surface, with sealed high-quality plastic insert on the back, complete with large but stylish Nexus logo and the trademark Motorola dimple. If you've seen a Moto X, then you know what to expect. The Nexus 6 is very similar, just supersized. But it's the form factor that's the real talking point here, I contend. The expansive screen with no visible controls when playing media or when the phone's off. The ease with which you can then pick up the phone the wrong way round by mistake. The mismatch between the size and what's normal in the phone world, arguably about a 5-inch screen these days, all remind me strongly of that Galaxy Nexus from 3 years ago. But I like this, much to my surprise. Yes, the Nexus 6 is demonstrably too big to be a mainstream one-handed phone, but it's amazing how quickly you get used to the size, and it's addictive. Watch a video or browse a website on the 6 and then go back to whatever else you're using, and you'll be surprised how much you miss the wider, taller, more cinematic experience. It may not be for everyone, but consider me a fan. There are a few other hardware niggles to mention. The nicely textured power button is positioned about 60% up on the right-hand side of the phone, and every single time I picked up the Nexus 6 at first, my thumb would miss it and hit the volume key instead. Plus, there's no slot for a micro SD card. With 32 gig at least on board, the lack of this isn't a showstopper, but a geek can dream, right? On to the camera though. Optical image stabilization seems, as a technology, to be making its way across the different manufacturers now. The components are clearly more expensive than non-OIS cameras, but at the same time they're becoming more commoditized and not the prerogative of high-end Nokias anymore. The camera in the Nexus 6 benefits greatly from OIS and low light, as you can see from the crispness of some of the samples shown here. I was very pleased by the photos produced by the 6 in general. On the phone screen, the Google Photos application didn't seem to be fully optimized and didn't take kindly to zooming right into one-to-one on the JPEG, so you can't really appreciate yet what the camera's doing. But view the photos on a desktop later shows the true quality. Colors are accurate, detail is right on the edge of being over-sharpened without going over the top, noise is kept down through clever algorithms. True, the Nexus 6's main camera may trail the Galaxy Note 4's, but there's not that much in it. Again, taking the Galaxy Nexus parallel. This had a good and fast camera that lagged just a little way behind the Galaxy S3 of the time, and the margins here are much the same. The only real downside to the camera here is the same as for almost every other Android camera phone with LED flash these days. Having the auto setting seems to require a 5-second illuminate, then focus, then make a cup of tea, then eventually take the photo routine. Forcing LED flash on takes the time down to about a second, but it's still way too slow. In fact, focusing on the Nexus 6 was slow and sometimes erratic here. Google has never been top dog in camera software, and the Nexus 6 continues the slight disappointment. So this is a video capture sample here on the Google Nexus 6, hopefully with OIS, as I pan round a rather wintry garden. Here's my summer house. Again, the very weak winter sunshine. How stable is this? I'm holding this at arm's length. The OIS should be working. Also the picture quality and the sound quality should be first class, but see what you think. Using the Nexus 6 to cruise around the Google world, helpfully split on the home screen into Google Create and Play folders. A nice idea. Everything is a pleasure. Yes, the QHD screen is complete overkill at well over 400 ppi, and yes, very little software actually does anything much with the pixels, but the overall experience, transitions aside, is smooth. Not all third-party applications support the material design language yet, of course, but almost all the built-ins do, and the result is colourful and fun. The geek in me still complains about the sheer amount of white on display most of the time and the inefficiency for AMOLED screens, but there's no doubting that Google's latest version of Android both looks futuristic and makes decent use of the higher resolution screens on devices like the Nexus 6. You'll be familiar with all the applications shipped on the device, though it's worth noting that legacy apps like Android Calendar and Android Gallery have now been replaced by Google Calendar and Google Photos. These are complete rewrites and not just name changes. Messenger is a new SMS handling app, presumably because of the sheer number of people who complained about Hangouts, including the capability. On devices with the right chipset, as here on the Nexus 6, there's the always-on voice detection capability, though it's turned off by default. Once enabled in Google Now settings, you can say with the screen turned off and optionally on a table, "OK Google, who is Steve Litchfield?" And so on.
Here is some information about Steve Litchfield.
Thank you. And it'll obey your search and other requests. It's a bit of a gimmick, to be honest, and no doubt there's an impact on battery life, but the main disadvantage is that every time another Android user near you utters the stock wake-up phrase, your device will leap into action too, possibly with unwanted consequences depending on what they ask for. Of more use is the new ambient display, again part of Lollipop on selected devices, wherein the AMOLED screen lights up with the time and date plus any new notifications as they arrive or when the Nexus 6 is picked up. It's a shame these couldn't live on screen permanently as is managed on some of the top Lumia Windows phones, but maybe Google's working on that too for its next trick. What's cool is that if you touch the ambient notifications, the screen comes alive and you can then interact with them easily, opening the appropriate application or responding. Security settings permitting, of course. If there's a PIN or password, then this still has to be asked for, rather putting pay to the quick access ethos, but at least the choice is up to you. The notification shade has been overhauled for Lollipop 2 with Google Now, mini cards, and with a hint of more. Swipe down a second time or use 2 fingers in the first place, and a very cyanogen style quick settings pane comes up, complete with flashlight and cast screen, both very useful indeed. I was prepared to dislike the initially overlarge Nexus 6 after a number of so-so reviews around the rest of the tech world, and I accept that Android 5.x is not really done yet, but the Nexus 6's relative purity and its ambition won me over in the end. It's not that much bigger than the Galaxy Note 2 I used for the best part of a year. Its screen is almost unsurpassed, the speakers, camera and other components are at very least in the top tier, and most of all, it's the best way to stay right on top of whatever Google is doing with its OS for at least the next 18 months. Too large? I say you're holding it wrong.